We are starting off with Module 6 today, and that is the 5 nines concept, and it has to do with availability. Who has a good idea of like what availability means? Remember when we talked about the CIA triad, that confidentiality, integrity, and availability? What was availability? What does that mean? And if you're new, just what does the word available mean to you?
Accessible.
Accessible, yeah.
Well, I remember the availability part was that the information was always there.
Yeah.
That it was not interrupted.
Absolutely. So, when we're designing security programs or we're managing infrastructure, it's important to keep it confidential. We don't want others to be able to see it. It's important to keep the integrity of the data. It is what it says it is. And then finally, availability. Like we can't lock it down so hard that our own users can't use it, right? That's the idea with availability. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Kind of how we focus on keeping our systems up for our end users. So there's a couple different activities that I wanted to call attention to that if you want to do it, if you have free time, there are, and I say that because I know that you two are in here and I know you don't have a ton of free time, but there are some packet tracer labs in here for router and switch redundancy and resilience. So things that you can do in order to make sure that the network portion of your infrastructure does stay up. And then also I did put some templates in here for incident response, for continuity, business continuity, and disaster recovery. So those templates I would download and just save to your own personal drive, because if you are going for that IT job, you can look like a freaking superhero if you come up with these plans. I'm giving you the template to kind of get you started, okay? So you're not just starting at ground zero, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to talk about high availability. So high availability makes sure that we have almost no downtime at all. We're going to talk about things that we can do to improve availability. We're going to talk about incident response. So let's say something happens, something does go down. How do you respond to that? What are some things you can do? And then finally, let's say what's happening like right now, Japan just got hit with, or is being hit with currently, a huge tsunami, okay? So with that, that's 100% disaster recovery. How do we recover from something being down? Because just because there's an incident doesn't mean that everything's down. That just means there might have been, some data was compromised or a system was compromised. Disaster recovery means it's down, and now we have to recover kind of from that. Okay. So starting off with the 5 nines concept, what the 5 nines concept is the amount of downtime that you have annualized, so broken down over a year. So that means you're going to have an uptime of 99.99%. And if you look at that table on the bottom, this is kind of just a breakdown of some of the more common uptimes that are promised, okay? So if it were Boingo, for you guys that have been here for a minute, do you think they have 5 nines availability? No, there ain't no way, right? Because that stuff is down all the time. And at here, it's not a big deal because it's to a consumer, so you don't really get wrapped up into things. But like me, for my clients, I do keep an eye on that because we signed a document that says my internet service provider is going to make sure that we have this level of uptime. And if it goes below that, you can actually get the FTC involved, the Federal Trade Commission, because they're not keeping up on their end of the data, and it has to do with information being exchanged. For example, my phone lines, like you still have to use old school phone lines for things in buildings. So like my elevator systems, like those have to have a phone line ran to them for the emergency phone. The alarms have to have at least one dedicated line. The second line can be shared with something else. You do what's called it's like an auto dialer that'll go on that second one. But you still have those old school ones because those can generate, or you can have really good uptime with those. Those are tried and true. There's not a lot of things that can go wrong with old school phone systems, okay? So with that, when you're working in an environment, you have to identify your systems because some systems are nice to have, but you don't have to have. Like, for example, our phase privileges that we have. Those don't have to necessarily, those aren't guaranteed to us, right? 3 meals a day, that's guaranteed. Like they have to do that, but they don't have to give us phase privileges. So they can take those away. So those don't have as much of an availability, if you will. So if you have a system like that that's on your network, let's say it is something that like monitors weather, temperature, or lights in a certain area, sprinkler systems, depending on the industry that you're in. Those systems that control those things aren't necessarily, they don't have to have 5 nines of availability. Those can have some downtime. And it's interesting, if you look at this chart, what I found most interesting was at 99.99% up, that means you can have 5 minutes of downtime for the year, okay? Just going back by 1/9, so 99.99%, that means you have 53 minutes of downtime. And then if you have 99.95, that means you can have 4 hours and 23 minutes of downtime throughout the year. Okay, so having that extra 9 that's there really does kind of restrict the amount of time that a system can be down. When we're looking at things that we're going to be doing in the field, we're definitely going to have some systems that are going to need 5 nines, right? We have to maintain communication between, where we're at and maybe downrange, right? Because they need that high availability network. So the couple things that you can do to make sure that you can maintain this uptime is eliminating single points of failure. So don't just have one cable ran, have 2. When you're buying servers and stuff for your infrastructure, making sure that they have redundant power supplies, redundant hardware as much as possible. Have a system in place that can detect if there is some type of error, right? We want to make sure that we know if like a hard drive's failing on a server or something like that. So some of the things that are super important and where you're going to see the environments that you're going to see this 5 nines concept, you're going to see it in the financial industry. I mean, what we look at as just the stock market going up and down all day is microseconds of transactions that are happening that could cost somebody billions of dollars, right? So we need to make sure that there are, they have that 5 nines of uptime, because that could trigger just a huge fire sale on the actual stock exchange and halt trading for the day. Another one would be healthcare. That's literally a life or death situation, just like public safety. Making sure that communication can happen, make sure the right people get the right information. That's where you're going to see this really, this kind of high availability needs. And obviously for us, what we do in the military, you're going to see it there as well. So what can we do? Like I said, one of the things was eliminating or reducing the single points of failure, but also having a system resiliency mindset when you are setting things up. So for example, let's say you are setting up a network a year from now, after you've gotten some more training and you're setting up a network for the first time. Okay, well, I want you to think back to this conversation that we have and say, okay, what if this goes down? Or maybe someone, an NCO or someone says, what do we need to do this? And you say, well, we're going to need 2 routers, we're going to need, 3 or 4 switches, and they might say, well, why do we need 2 routers? Like, there's enough cable. I mean, can we just use one? And you have to then present it to them. The risk in that is if this router goes down, then we lose access to communication, but then put that risk on them and get them to sign off on, hey, like we're not going to do this other router, and let them assume that risk. It's up to us at our level to present a system in which we use our understanding, our know-how, especially when we have that security plus, we can look at it from that angle. Okay. Any questions on the 5 nines and kind of that portion of availability? Does that make sense, kind of what it is and what we can do to prevent our systems from going down, kind of at a high level? Good, not confusing. Yeah. Yeah.
This downtime don't apply to like maintenance, like if you're doing maintenance, or just how.
So you'll have scheduled maintenance windows, but a lot of times, depending on the system, so where the system that you're talking about that you would do maintenance might fall on this 99.9%, because it's going to go down for a minute if you have to do like updates and stuff that require a reboot. So in that case, you would have 2 similar servers, and we're going to talk about load balancing, and you would take one, so all the traffic would go to this one over here. You'd bring this one back up, let it kind of level out, and then maybe a day or 2 later, you would then take this one down and all the traffic would go to this one. Now, there are times that you're just going to have to take it down, and just communication is key there. Say, hey, I have to take the service. And I did Thursday night, I did maintenance on one of the servers for one of my clients. And at 2 o'clock, I sent out a message saying, hey, I'm doing updates tonight. It's not going to affect anybody in the building. The maintenance window is from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. And then I just, at that time, kicked it off and made sure everything was up to date, make sure we're good to go, and then brought it back up. And I didn't need that whole time. I literally needed like 20 minutes to work on this server. But I let them know ahead of time, and they didn't experience any downtime. But then what's nice about that, like sending out that communication is, so let's say something wasn't working. The person that's on site can kind of be my my catcher. You know what I mean? Saying, hey, TJ's working on it. Like, he told us there was a maintenance issue, like, and so I'm not getting all these phone calls now and pulling me away from work. It kind of puts them out there, like they're up to date. They all saw the email, but a lot of stuff doesn't hit my desk then. But yeah, communication is key for stuff like that. Yep. So one of the key things before you even get started with availability is understanding what you have. A lot of times, like, you're going to show up to your unit and you're not going to know what anything is. Or if you're going and you're getting a career, you're National Guard and you're going back to get a job, you're going to walk into an environment that you literally have no idea where anything is. So how can you be responsible for keeping high availability if you don't even know what's on the network, right? Well, unfortunately, that's your job. Day one, like, you're required to make sure that these systems have high availability. So the sooner that you can get everything under management, or ask, hey, do you guys have an inventory of what you have here? Where can I find information on kind of the environment? Things like that. That's going to help you to understand what these systems are. And then you can slowly start going through them and making sure that you understand kind of what they do, what their purpose is on the network, and what you can do to make sure you maintain that high level of availability. So I put a spreadsheet up on Google Classroom for you guys. It's a template that I put together probably about, 7 or 8 years ago, that has kind of your top level to get you started for inventory. But again, this is something that you could walk into an environment and look like a superhero when, 3 days into the job, you bust out this inventory of everything that's there, what needs updates, what it's used for. Those are the things that are going to make you kind of separate yourself from others. Or it can just be your own personal, so you have kind of a quick reference of, hey, what is that server's IP address? And you can look at your own inventory and know, oh, yep, that's 192.168.1.37. Boom, you remote into that machine and you can start working on it. But some of the things that you look at on a system are the hardware that's there, the operating system, the operating system, or the like switches, what version of Cisco they're running, which iOS they're running, what applications are running on certain servers. I had an issue a couple weeks ago when we did our initial scan of the network, because there's tools that automatically do this for you as well, that will go through and map out the network and give you a lot of this information. There was one server that was, we started getting messages on our alert system that it was running out of disk space. And so we went and looked, and then there was just this log that was out of control from this old printing software that was on there that wasn't even used anymore. It was phased out. But the log there was a bug in the software, and it made that log become like 95 gigabytes for just a log that normally should be like 20 kilobytes. So, because we didn't have a good audit of that software, we didn't really even know that software was running, it caused us some issues. That's why understanding like the software that's on there and knowing kind of how it affects the business is super important. So when you're looking at an organization, you might be kind of overwhelmed. Like, where do you even start with inventorying everything? Well, first and foremost is asset classification. So asset classification is, where does this piece of equipment, where does it fall? Does it fall under the printing bucket? Does it fall under the, the data storage bucket? Does it fall in the end user bucket? Like, where do you even start putting these different devices? So taking time and kind of creating your buckets or the categories that things are going to go in is going to help you to become more efficient when you're doing your inventory of the entire system. Another thing that I wanted to point out is, we've talked about it before, but the CVE database and doing scans on your systems to make sure that there aren't any vulnerabilities that are on there. There's tools like Nessus, which is NESSUS, that can automatically scan systems, and it'll tell you if there are vulnerabilities that are out there. So being able to identify and making sure that these devices are secure before you even get started is going to help you kind of with your plan of attack moving forward. And then finally, risk analysis. We've talked a lot about that, where, what effect does this system have? If it goes down, what is the risk that's involved? Like, is the business going to lose money? Are lives going to be lost? Or is it something that, if it goes down, it goes down, no big deal? You kind of that point is where you put a plan to, okay, if that happens, then we need to do that. And we're going to talk about those plans a little bit later on in the chapters. Finally, mitigation, that's something that we can do with risk, which is what can we do to make sure that those systems don't go down? We've said, okay, this is a really important system. Okay, let's talk about how we can, what systems can we put in place to make sure it doesn't go down? And when it comes to the cybersecurity side of all this, we talk about this term, which is defense in depth. And with that is where you take, you create multiple layers to making sure that this system stays up at all times. So it could be an antivirus is one level. Having policies that say, hey, who's able to log into this machine? That's another level. So it's not just, hey, we're just going to run antivirus and hope for the best. No, you have multiple layers. Remember when we looked at that cube, the McCummers cube, and there was policies that we could do. We could put technical things up there. That's what goes into having that layered levels of security and making sure that these systems can stay up and they're not susceptible to attackers and bringing them down. So we've talked about a single point of failure already. A term that you need to know as well, and this could creep in on the Security Plus, is this idea of N+1. So for example, on the screen, N is the 4 tires that are on your vehicle, right? So you have 4 tires, but then if something happens, if you don't have that spare tire, then you're kind of screwed, right? Like you're just gonna be sitting on the side of the road. So that's the +1, where you carry one with you at all times. So in the environment that you work in, from the sergeants that I've talked to here, you will have access to basically a room, storage closet that has access to extra components. So extra hard drives, extra RAM, keyboards, mice. It could be an extra laptop. You could have a switch that's in a rack that's all configured and it's just a spare. So if something goes down, you just have to run in there really quick and move ports over. So that way it's good to go. So N+1 redundancy is where you have one good copy and then you always have one backup. Now that could be inside the system itself. So it could be, like I said, a server that has multiple power supplies. That would be N+1. It could be, having those spare parts just on the shelf. The only time this has kind of bitten me was I didn't have extra fans. That was one thing I never carried for my servers. So earlier last year, we had a fan go down, and just having one little fan inside the server made it so it wouldn't even start. Like, it wasn't affecting the cooling at all. It was running super cool, but just because that one piece went down, it actually took the whole server down. Didn't really have, it's not something that you think to have on the shelf because there's literally like 8 fans that go across the server. So what I ended up having to do is literally use a paperclip and jump the connection to fool the system into thinking it was still plugged in while I ordered one overnight. So little things like that that's what makes IT kind of fun and frustrating at the same time. But being able to go into whatever job you're going to, and just having this mindset like, hey, why don't we have any hard drives on the shelf? Do you think we could order some? Or, hey, I noticed we didn't have any spare RAM. Or, hey, you used the last hard drive. Did you order more? And just having that kind of mentality in the back of your head to make sure that things stay up and working. So another way that we can ensure availability is by using RAID. And we talked about RAID a little bit in previous classes. I did post like 3 or 4 videos that explain and break down RAID for you. But the big thing that you need to know, kind of again, that higher overarching understanding is we're using multiple hard drives in order to make sure data stays safe. So if one of those hard drives dies, you'll still maintain your uptime, that 5 nines that you're kind of going for. So what RAID allows us to do is, let's say we have this file, it's 10 gigabytes. It's coming in, it hits the RAID. Instead of it just storing it on that first hard drive in the RAID, let's say we have 3 drives on there. What it's going to do, it's going to break it up into 3 different pieces and put them across the drives. So if one of those dies, it's able to look at it does math, and it's able to rebuild that third drive. So then you take one off the shelf, you plug it into your network attached storage, and then it'll go through the process of rebuilding. Now, it won't necessarily stay up the whole time. Like, you will have to bring that that entire array down to rebuild it. But there are, like, you can basically have 2 RAIDs that are going simultaneously, so that way all the data is going to both of them and kind of mirror them. That's something that if it has to be that super, super high availability, you're able to do that. But I encourage you, like, even if you're not going into cybersecurity, just even to do your 25 Bravo role better, watch those videos that explain RAID, so that way if someone says, oh yeah, we have a RAID 5 setup, that you know what that actually means. That you know, oh, we need to have X amount of disks in order to make sure that we can set up this array, if that makes sense. So please watch those videos. It is worth your time. But again, I want to make sure that we're staying on time today and we get through all the content. If we have time at the end, I'll throw them up on the projector. So just like for hard drives, we make sure that we have redundancy, or data we have redundancy. You can actually do this with your networks as well. Did you guys do anything with spanning tree at all in Essentials? STP or PortFast or anything like that?
STP is
Spanning tree protocol?
no, he's thinking about shielded twisted pair.
Oh, might be. Yeah, yeah, shield. Yeah. So spanning tree is where, if you look at this network diagram that you have here, do you guys understand like how broadcasts work on a network, where everybody gets the message?
Yeah.
They kind of went over that, right? So if the 3 of us are all talking, okay, and I tell you a message and I tell you the exact same message, and we work like a network, you would each go tell that message, but I'm going to say it again and I'm going to say it again. So when we have this message that's doing this whole thing, it's going to create what's called a loop, okay? And with that, it becomes a broadcast storm. So that means all these broadcasts are going out, and then all of a sudden this bandwidth that we have is now going to get clogged because these messages are all just going in a circle, okay? So what we have to do is we want redundancy, right? Like, we want, if trunk 3 goes down, we want to be able to send data to trunk 2, right? So going, let's say the data originated here from these PCs, comes up here and boom, tsunami happens, takes out trunk number 1. Well, this data is going to come here if this is the only one that we have, and it's going to say destination not found. We can't get out to the internet, right? So what spanning tree protocol does is you hook up these links, but then STP will negotiate it. Actually, it's really cool how it works. It'll actually use the MAC addresses and stuff in order to say, hey, this is the best path here. We're going to go ahead and turn off this trunk link 2, and then it'll go into this listening stage. So at that point, let's say information stops going over this trunk, then it's going to say, hey, trunk 1 must be down, or I'm sorry, trunk 3 must be down. We need to go ahead and turn trunk 2 back on. We're not going to have a loop if we turn this back on. So then at that point, let's say trunk 3 does go down, boom, this little red dot goes away, and now the data can go to switch 1 and then to switch 3, should something happen here. So again, spanning tree, it's really cool technology, something that I guess is beyond what you're going to do here, but something that you're going to run into in the real world, because you're going to try to image workstations, and then all of a sudden it's going to time out because that port doesn't have something called PortFast turned on. So it's doing this whole negotiation process, because this process could take 30 seconds to kind of listen and make sure that this thing that's being plugged in isn't a network device. So you're going to be like, oh, these computers won't image. We're trying to image them over the network. None of them are working. What's going on? Well, then you look in the closet and you see that little switch port that should be green. It's actually amber. It's because of spanning tree protocol. So just be aware that this technology it's turned on by default on Cisco switches. So if you're having issues with specifically imaging, because I've ran into that 100 times, this could be the culprit behind it. Another thing that we can do on the network side is use what's called a first hop redundancy protocol, or FHRP. So with that, we just have multiple routers. In that last one, it was switches, which switches are for the local LAN, where routers help us connect to other networks. They're kind of our gateway to those other networks. So you can see our example that we have here, where we have these several different routers that go out to the cloud. So should one of these go down, we have another router here that allows us to get out to the internet. So the first hop, so FHRP first hop, is from the cloud itself or from the internet onto our network when that data hops on there. So that's one way to remember it. But it's the same thing. It's basically a standby router. So if one dies, it'll automatically basically take that IP address of that other router and it'll become that router. So all that traffic will then flow through this one that we have on the left or the right. Does that make sense? We're understanding that?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if the router in the middle,
Mm-hmm.
if it dies and it goes to the router to the left,
Yep.
takes that router.
Yep.
Would that router have that IP address? And it looks good?
Yeah, so what happens is, because what you're thinking is, do I have to go change the default gateway on all my computers then, right? Because that's one of the things that you have to have. Yes, it'll take on that identity. They both actually, what happens is they both have that IP address, but one, it's not used, so it's not advertised out. Remember with ARP requests, that's how we find out what the IP address is of something. It's just not advertising that out there, so nobody knows that two have the same IP address. And there's different first hop redundancy protocols, but that's kind of an easy way to kind of understand how it would work. Yep, it'll take on that interface IP address. These are the couple. Again, this is a very Cisco heavy course. That's who did the actual curriculum. So those are the ones that you'll see. VRRP is probably one of the ones that's used quite a bit, and the hot standby is as well. But you won't need to know those for the security plus. Okay, when it comes to redundancy, I put a video up that talks about hot sites and cold sites, and we've talked about this in previous classes as well. So it's redundancy for the location that you're in. So here in the US, we have hot sites. So obviously it's going to be like 12 ranks higher than us that'll actually use these hot sites. But let's say missile launch, okay? Do you think we're only going to have one place that can launch those missiles? No, we're going to make sure that there's multiple, right? So with that, they probably staff an entire location where people come in and do a job, but that job is not actually doing anything. It's literally, if shit hits the fan, they kind of get activated in order to do it. It's the same thing for IT. So you'll have like call centers and stuff where they can, within minutes, migrate an entire call system or a call center to a totally different state if something happens with like the network connection to this one. People are literally sitting at desks waiting to start taking phone calls. Now, there's other ones that are, maybe it's not as, mission critical. Maybe it's one of those ones that we can have some downtime. So those are going to be sites that are like cold sites. And what that means is you might have a location where you could, do this. You might have some desks there. You might even have some equipment there, but it's not like you're staffing it 24/7, right? It's going to take you time in order to get people over there to start doing the job. Another thing too is just entire systems. So in the state of Ohio, the way it works is the school system, like they have their own network, but then they talk to what's called an A site. So that A site is going to be the ones that manage like all the grade books, the report cards, all of our network services. They have a various amount of services. So we had an issue about 2.5 years ago with our A site where they had hardware that went down. Well, luckily they had done disaster recovery planning, and the state actually offers where within minutes they are able to actually migrate that entire site down to Columbus, Ohio, and they didn't have any downtime at all. And with that, they were able to make sure that the websites, the grades, all that stuff, they were able to migrate that within probably 45 minutes, and us end users didn't really see anything different at all. They were able to do a live migration down there. So again, it's used quite a bit in IT, but you won't have to set up anything like that in the near future at all. But it's gotten a lot easier than it used to be. So incident response, I did put some templates up there for incident response. So we've talked about different things, different ideas on how we can build these systems and make sure we maintain availability. But what happens when something does go down, okay? So first and foremost is that preparation, doing, those things that we talked about, making sure we have spanning tree protocol, making sure that we have extra parts on the shelf. But then from there, we need a way to detect the incident. So if you've gone through software, you've messed with the log file, right? As one of the PEs, you had to go into the event viewer and you had to save the security to the desktop. You remember that?
Yeah.
So with that, that is a part of detection. Even just the Windows logs that are on servers, they're going to give us some information. So what you can actually do is take those logs and have them automatically go to a centralized location, and from there you can trigger alerts where you get like emails and stuff like that. And I can show you kind of an example of that, because one of my servers is kind of acting up right now with some RAM. So I can show you kind of what that looks like. So first is detection, seeing the issue, and then analysis, looking over logs. From there, containment, eradication, and recovery. So let's say it is a virus outbreak, or you have someone, on your actual network itself. Then we're going to make sure we contain them to make sure it doesn't spread anymore. Get rid of the viruses, and then recover, rebuild. Maybe it's a ransomware. What did we talk about? The best thing? What's the best way to combat ransomware? Who remembers? From backups, right? We're going to recover from our backups. So we're going to contain it, get that actual machine off the network. We're then going to eradicate it or just wipe the drive and then recover. We're going to bring our backups and reinstall on that actual system. And then finally is our AAR, our post-incident follow-up. What went well, how can we fix this so it doesn't happen in the future, and just be better. So every single time from these failures, you're learning how you can build a better and stronger system. And again, I put a really good template that talks about incident response. This is a very super high level of just the kind of incident response plans. But I gave you a full template that if you'd like to read through it, you can, or just save it in your rainy day file for when you do have that kick-ass IT job. So some things that you're going to have to know for the Security Plus. You're going to have to know what a NAC is, or Network Admission Control. So, and we've talked about these before. This is where when a machine gets onto a network, it's kind of separated from the rest of kind of like Gen Pop, if you will. Think about it how when we got to basic training, we went to reception first, right? And they made sure that we had our immunizations, right? We do the same thing with computers. We make sure they have antiviruses on them before we let them on our network. We made sure their paperwork was right? They made sure we had all of our paperwork ready to go, all of our orders and stuff, right? Well, we're going to do the same thing to that computer. Make sure Windows updates are done, making sure that, it'll do a quick scan on it. After making sure it has viruses, we're going to scan it and make sure there's nothing on it. That's what a NAC does. And then once the NAC says it's ready, then it'll allow it into the general population or on the network itself, okay? So you see them a lot like in colleges and universities. I'm surprised you don't see them in the military more. But it's just when you see NAC, it's just that separation before it allows you to be on the network. IDSs we've talked about. Who can tell our new guys what the difference is between an IDS and an IPS?
So an IDS will just detect if there's bad traffic. For example, it'll just like send out a bunch of alerts like, hey, this part right here has an issue, but a prevention system will take steps to actively prevent the issue.
Absolutely. So let's say, for example, with my students back home, this is something that we're fighting currently for my teaching job, is my students like to take what we learn in the classroom, but then try it out on the school network, which they're kids. So one of those things is using Nmap to scan. So that's like the first step that you have when you're identifying like what you're going to attack on a network. And Nmap scans are actually somewhat hard to detect. As far as Nmap has some tools involved that like you can slow down scans and stuff like that. So we're at the point now where we're figuring out the detection. So we're just going to be able to get an alert of what computer is doing this. Our next step then is the prevention, which means we're going to get that MAC address and we're going to blacklist it from the network. So then they just can't connect to the network anymore. Okay, they can change their MAC address. They're smart enough to get around it. But that's what the difference is between just detecting, hey, there's a virus here, and hey, I'm going to go ahead and remove this virus, or I'm going to move this computer to its own network. Okay, that's the difference, the big difference between that IPS. You won't need to know NetFlow and advanced threat intelligence. So this is something that we're seeing more and more kind of on a day-to-day basis. Before, you used to have to pay a lot of money to get threat intelligence, and there are some services out there that are expensive, but now because cybersecurity is so prevalent and these attacks are so prevalent, this is something where you're able to get this threat intelligence relatively free, or the FBI will just send it out. There was just actually yesterday I was reading in the healthcare sector right now in payment processors where billions of dollars are being kind of shifted to personal accounts instead of going to the person that's supposed to receive the payment. And this threat intelligence just hit my inbox, like, hey, let your users know. We realize that you're not in the healthcare vertical, but your users are. So I sent an email out to my clients, but also like to all the teachers I work with, like, hey, keep an eye on your bank account right now. Like, healthcare just got hit. So that's the information that'll kind of go out. But behind that is, hey, the FBI will say, here are ways that you can prevent this from happening. Retrain your users on social engineering, making sure that XYZ, is up to date. They'll actually tell you kind of how to stop the threat from occurring. So now we're moving on to, okay, we responded to an incident and it's back up, but then boom, we got hit by a tsunami. What are we going to do? How are we going to recover? Okay, so you have to have a plan in place. And I think I talked to you guys before about a lady that I had met who was the tech director at a school that got hit by a tornado. You guys remember that? Yeah. So when like the next morning, like they literally drove to the school and they didn't know if their superintendent or the principal were even alive. So like, what are we supposed to do? Like, before we can even start recovering, and like, where are all the files? Like, there's not even a school here anymore. Like, where do you even start? So at that point, that's why disaster recovery planning is so important. And then the other part of that is the business continuity, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. So from the disaster recovery side, we're talking about the data and the information and the systems. Okay, so what are we going to do if it gets hit by a hurricane or tornado? Or what if a logic bomb goes off? Who remembers what a logic bomb was when we talked about it?
Somebody gets fired. It's a trigger
It's like a timer or something that triggers it.
Yeah, so like, let's say you have a user who gets fired, and before they left, they set up a piece of malware to run that if they're not on the network anymore, then delete all the files. Okay, that would be a logic bomb. So that also kind of falls under that disaster recovery. Like, if somebody does that, what are we supposed to do? So a disaster recovery plan is going to make sure that you have steps in place to be able to rebuild the systems, that's where your backups are going to be. Because when we looked at that chart for uptime, we said there are some things that, yeah, you have to have that 5 nines, but other things maybe aren't as important. Well, when you're doing your disaster recovery plan, you have to start with getting those systems that have the 5 nines availability up first before you get the lower things. So your disaster recovery plan will go through, and it'll be kind of step by step of what you need to come up. So that way, let's say also, when you're talking about these type of things, it might not be you that's there. You might be dead, okay? So with that, your disaster recovery plan has to stand on its own. If TJ's not there, then call this person, and this person will then take this disaster recovery plan and make sure, it gets, step by step. And a lot of times you'll work on a subcommittee when you put these together, and everybody will kind of have their weigh in on what's important, and it's not just going to be one person. But if you are starting either a consulting business or, you're getting that job in IT, even suggesting like, hey, where's your disaster recovery plan? Asking that question when you first get there. And they say, oh, we don't have one. Like, you should probably freak out a little bit. But at the same time, like, it shows like you are thinking in that direction. And that's what the Army is looking for. That's why they want you to take your Security Plus, is because they want you to have this mindset. Okay? This isn't something that's taught in 25 Bravo school. It used to be, but now that's why they want you to take the Security Plus, because A, cybersecurity infections and attacks are on the rise, but also stuff like this, like making sure that systems stay up and availability, is a big part of our job. So the difference between, like I said, disaster recovery and business continuity is more like, with disaster recovery, this is what we're going to do to kind of rebuild after this happens. Business continuity is saying, what are we going to do to, let's say, we don't have power in a building. Are we going to order in generators? Are we going to, like, who's going to make sure the fuel's in the generator? Who is, where are we going to store this fuel? Stuff like that. Like, you really have to think from all angles, and making sure that you've fully laid out these processes to make sure that when this happens, you can reference these 2 documents and start giving orders. Like, hey, you need to go do this. Everything's just going to kind of kick off. Now, some of these things can be automated. So in the building that I'm in right now, if we lose power, the generators instantly come on and the lights don't even turn off. I mean, it's instant. We don't see any downtime. There's not even really a brownout per se when it happens. And it's because we've gone through and we've done this planning already, and we purchased generators that would keep systems up and going. Because again, we're in a school system, so we have to make sure that, door lock, safety, fire, all that stuff, we keep all that up to keep the kids safe. And again, automate as much of that stuff as possible. So a few best practices are making sure that everybody involved, like in your committee, takes an active role in doing this. Or if it is just doing it, make sure you at least present it to more than one person, because you don't just create this plan and put it, in a file folder in a desk somewhere. Like, this is a living document, and then whenever a new system is brought in, you have to make sure that it becomes part of the business continuity plan as well as the disaster recovery plan. Another thing is making sure that you test out both of these plans, making sure you're testing your backups on a regular basis. It's super, super important. I know when I was a one-man band at one of the first school districts that I worked at, this was one thing that it's not that I didn't have time, I didn't make time for, which luckily, knock on wood, we didn't have anything happen. But when it came down to a teacher not being able to teach and me saying, hey, I have to test my backups today, obviously that teacher is going to take precedence over doing that, and it constantly always gets pushed back. So making sure that you're testing your plan, testing your backups, doing inventory to make sure that somebody didn't take that last hard drive off the shelf and make sure that it didn't, that we didn't reorder more. Doing things like that is going to make sure that you are successful, and then it doesn't create what we call a RGE, or a resume generating event, which is what we say in the IT world for losing your job. So, like I said, we talked about a lot of the things that had to do with availability, which is the final portion of our CIA triad. We are getting to the end. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be doing it's going to be resume, LinkedIn, certifications. It's more on kind of you guys and making sure that when you leave here, you're ready to get a job, that like I said, your LinkedIn profile, your kind of online footprint is locked in. And then after that, the one right before that is our last kind of techie one. So I think we should have 2 more sessions to go. Yep, because this was 6, so we have 7, which is kind of techie, and then 8 is that final one with your resumes and stuff. Any questions about what we went over today?